Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into a video by the Great War Channel. It's why did the First World War break out? On the thumbnail it said, did a gunshot really start World War I? In reference to the Franz Ferdinand assassination. So I'm curious to hear what they have to say. I don't think I've ever done a video from the Great War Channel. I may be wrong, but I don't think I have. So let's get into it and hear what they have to say.
The origins of the First World War are still the cause of lively debate amongst historians more than 100 years after the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in June 1914. The complex July crisis that followed the deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek led to a generalized great power war that shaped the 20th century. But this crisis can also be seen in the broader context of the so-called long fuse, long-term causes that made war more likely in post-Napoleonic Europe. So let's take a look at the outbreak of the First World War. In the decades before the First World War broke out in 1914, industrialization led to huge increases in wealth and urbanization, but also created stark inequalities in society. Ruling groups needed to manage the resulting tensions, so encouraging nationalism and pride in imperial expansion helped to channel the anger and energy of the popular classes elsewhere. But this caused problems abroad. Britain, France, and Russia had well-established empires by the late 1800s when a new player arrived on the scene. Germany became a unified state in 1871 and eventually began to create its own overseas empire and blue water navy to appease its growing commercial class and to offset the powerful influence of social democratic parties at home.
So we've obviously talked about this before in other World War I videos, but the Franco-Prussian War leads into Germany becoming a unified state, right? They go from a bunch of different kind of German regions to one unified German state, and it totally turns European politics on its head. I mean, you have this massive state with this massive economy, military, you can't even hardly imagine something like this in the modern day. I've heard it being compared in a past video, and then in a series that I've listened to on Spotify, I've heard it referenced as the EU. If the EU today formed one single nation with one economy and military and everything like that, that's kind of what this would look like, or the closest comparison to something in the modern day. Britain has issues with this because they immediately, with the creation of a true blue water navy from the Germans, Britain immediately feels threatened. You have this major power that has appeared on the European mainland, and not only is it on the European mainland, but then it's starting to create a navy that is going to rival Britain's navy. And so Britain immediately doesn't like this. However, you have what I believe is one of the greatest bureaucrats, politicians, statesmen ever in the history of the world in Otto von Bismarck running things for this new burgeoning German empire.
Germany's ambitions for its, quote, place in the sun caused a spike in tensions between the great powers, who were already in competition with each other. Great power rivalries became part of popular culture with jingoistic press, militaristic education in schools, and everything from children's toys and thriller novels, and even movies focusing on feats of arms or dangerous potential enemies. These political and social tensions caused a growing anxiety among many Europeans, and the danger that they might lead to war was heightened by increasing militarization. As the great powers expanded their empires and worried about rivals, they also built up their military capability and political alliances. Germany's expansion and naval buildup provoked reactions from the other powers. The UK responded by building even more warships, including the new Dreadnought class. Meanwhile, Austria...
Yeah, the Dreadnoughts really, really are awesome ships for the time. Not only do you have this fear kind of driving things, which you absolutely do. You have a fear from basically all of the major powers about all of the other major powers going forward, but you also have, because of the ramp up in technology and military equipment, you have almost like this itch to use, everybody feels like they are supremely powerful in this new age. And so everybody's kind of trying to expand and prove their might in different ways, but nobody's going so far as to prove it by starting a major war with a major power in Europe.
Hungary and Russia clashed over influence in the Balkans, where new independent states had largely replaced the weakened Ottoman Empire with Russian help. By 1914, a system of alliances bound most of the great powers to each other, for better or for worse. France and Russia had been allies since 1894, and the Triple Alliance connected Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy.
Which, that alliance between France and Russia was literally the bane of Otto von Bismarck's existence. Like, his whole thing was that France and Russia could never ally with each other because Germany would then be surrounded, right? So his whole thing, when he was the main German statesman on the world stage, was to keep France and Russia as far apart from each other as humanly possible. It ends up that it doesn't go his way because you have a Kaiser come in that is, well, dumber than I am. But that is literally his whole thing is, and I honestly believe that World War I might have been able to be prevented had that alliance not been allowed to happen. Because if Russia, which is the direction that Bismarck went, was Russia, right? If Russia is on the side of the German Empire, I absolutely do not think that Britain or France would be willing to jump into a war against Germany and Russia. I don't think any mixture of alliances with Britain and France at the head is going to be willing to take on that challenge. And so it really is a big change of trajectory when France and Russia eventually end up allying with each other.
Britain had maintained a policy of splendid isolation for most of the 19th century, but its fear of German naval expansion brought it closer to the Franco-Russian bloc to create the Triple Entente. The danger of such alliances was that a conflict involving one or two powers was more likely to drag all of them into a European war. Germany felt surrounded by potential enemies, so it tried to test Entente resolve during two diplomatic crises in Morocco in 1905 and 1911. The British and French held firm, but there was no war, which angered German Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke.
The Elder, by the way, that's the Elder von Moltke. God, the Pickelhaube helmets are so freaking awesome. I'm going to get one. At some point, I'm going to get one of those helmets, and it's going to be somewhere on the set. I'm going to figure it out.
If we again slip away from this Moroccan affair with our tail between our legs, and if we cannot bring ourselves to put forward a determined claim which we are prepared to force through with the sword, I shall despair of the future of the German Empire. I shall then resign, but before handing in my resignation, I shall move to abolish the army and to place ourselves under Japanese protectorate. We shall then be in a position to make money without interference and develop into ninnies. Germany's worries about its situation in Europe caused its government to shift priority from the navy, which had angered Britain, back to the army, which caused France and Russia to expand their armies. To many in Berlin, it seemed that time was on the Entente's side, and Germany's chances would be better if war came sooner rather than later. Historians still debate whether Germany's assertiveness or Franco-British refusal to share international power played a greater role in increasing tensions.
Well, imagine the EU situation, right? Because I've got to be honest, I actually do have a good bit of empathy for the situation that Germany was in going into World War One. Imagine if that EU scenario came true and all of the EU countries became one major, massive country, and then the rest of the world powers basically like told it to go sit in the corner and, like it's you're a new power. We got to all this stuff before you did. Go sit in the corner and like there's no way that would fly. The EU would be like, "Wait, we have an economy and military bigger than everybody else. Why would we listen to what you guys say?" And so I understand the kind of frustration of Germany when going into this conflict. They feel like they are a great power being denied kind of like the spoils of being a great power. And when you see and hear some of the things that are being said in places like Britain or France, then you realize it really is just a power thing. Like Britain fears Germany and the rival that they could become in this European system. And so they're trying to put it in its place. France and Russia immediately start this expansion of the military or of the army specifically whenever Germany starts ramping up its armed forces. It's a power struggle back and forth, but I can understand the viewpoint of the Germans who say, like, we're a great power just like everybody else at this table. Why are we being treated differently just because we're younger?
While great power alliances hardened across Europe, more trouble was brewing in the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia from the Ottomans in 1908 upset Russia and angered Serbian nationalists, who wanted closer ties with South Slav populations in Austria-Hungary. Russia then supported the independent Slav states in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which Serbia gained more territory. Tensions between Austria-Hungary and Russia rose sharply over the Serb issue and got even worse when Austrian counterintelligence officer Alfred Riedel was exposed as a Russian spy in 1913. Long-term causes of the war, like imperial competition or military alliances, didn't mean that war was inevitable. For a full-on war to break out, a crisis had to come that would force governments to decide for war. On June 28, 1914, Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo.
I don't believe even at this point war is completely inevitable. I think had the leaders of the belligerents been, well, better, that war could have still been averted here. It's in the weak leadership that war eventually breaks out. It's a lot of stuff. Bad decisions, bad timing, unlucky circumstances. It's a bunch of stuff. But really, I think strong leadership could have overcome this, at least for the time being.
Those shots triggered the July crisis. Following the killings, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Most historians agree today there was some semi-official Serbian involvement in the crime, although whether Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic and the rest of his government knew about the plot is hotly debated. In any case, in 1914, there was no proof of Serbian government involvement. The assassination itself did not bring about war directly. Austria-Hungary was disappointed that other European governments did not condemn the killings more forcefully, a view shared by the German ambassador to Russia, Friedrich von Portales. Not only in the press, but also in society, one meets almost only with unfriendly judgments on the murdered Archduke. But the Serbian response was the one that mattered most to Austria-Hungary. Officially, Pasic issued condolences, but also claimed that the assassinations were an internal Austro-Hungarian issue. The Serbian investigation lasted only a week and found no evidence of government involvement. Serb nationalists and newspapers were less diplomatic. Some openly blamed the Austro-Hungarians themselves for the killings, while others praised the assassins. When the Austro-Hungarians complained, Pasha said that he had neither the tools nor the inclination to censor the free Serbian press. Back in Vienna, the Imperial Council met to discuss their options. Chief of Staff Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf had argued forcefully for war for years, and he wasn't alone. The Foreign Ministry was flooded with letters from Austro-Hungarian notables calling for an armed response. Austrian artist Josef von Storch wrote on June 30th. Last year, I took the liberty of writing to say that we would have to learn how to tolerate Serbian impertinences without resorting to war. Now, the matter has acquired an entirely different aspect. Konrad put it more bluntly. War, war, war. The Austrian government decided on a military response to punish Serbia and resolve the issue of greater Serb nationalism seen to be destabilizing the empire. The war was meant to be local and quick, but attacking Serbia meant risking conflict.
That's a very big point here. It was meant to be local and quick. Local and quick. Like, it's going to be neither of those things, but that's what it's meant to be.
Conflict with Russia, and for Austria, that was unthinkable without Germany's support. After the assassinations, the German ambassador to Vienna had urged restraint, but on July 6th, Kaiser Wilhelm made Germany's position clear by giving Austria the so-called blank check. Austrian ambassador Count Laszlo Szögyeni-Marich reported the German promise to Vienna. The Kaiser authorized me to inform our gracious majesty that we might rely upon Germany's full support. If we had really recognized the necessity of warlike action against Serbia, Kaiser Wilhelm would regret if we did not make use of the present moment, which is all in our favor. Wilhelm went on to say that he felt that Russia was not ready for war, and if Austria did attack Serbia, it should do so as quickly as possible. So by early July, 4 outcomes seemed possible. A peaceful negotiated settlement, an Austro-Serbian war in the Balkans, a continental war involving Austria, Russia, Germany, and probably France, or a world war if Britain and its empire joined France and Russia. Only Austria-Hungary and Russia had direct interests in the Balkans, but the system of European alliances would likely draw other states in as well. However, neither the Triple Alliance nor the Triple Entente called for automatic participation in a war. Instead, each state had to decide how far they were willing to go. The Triple Entente powers generally preferred a negotiated settlement to the crisis. If war did break out, Britain and France favored limiting the war to the Balkans, although Russia was more willing to accept a great power war over Serbia. Russia wanted to keep its reputation as protector of the Balkan Slavs and potentially expand its influence in the area around the Turkish Straits.
This is where the historians who think that Russia is to blame for this war, essentially, this is what they point to, right? That Russia has more to gain and lose in this conflict. They are very willing to go fight. They're willing for it to turn into a big war. And they have some troops that have mobilized pre-mobilization of the entire army as a whole. And so these are some of the reasons for the historians that point and lay the blame at Russia's feet. This is some of the things they point to.
That were so important to Russian trade and power projection. If it came to a great power war, France would support its ally in Russia and hope that Britain would join as well. In Britain, a major war was unpopular with the public, business circles, and some members of cabinet. Some politicians, like Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, reasoned that if a major war broke out, the outcome would be better for Britain if it joined Russia and France. If Germany and Austria defeated France and Russia, British interests and security would badly suffer, but there was still significant opposition in the UK. As far as the Entente powers were concerned, a major war still seemed unlikely. Understanding Austro-German intentions is trickier, and historians still debate them. Their leaders saw little benefit in a negotiated settlement. It wouldn't resolve the issue of Serbian nationalism or improve Austria's position in the Balkans. The best outcome would probably come from a localized Austro-Serbian war. At the same time, launching such a war meant accepting the risk of a continental war against France and Russia and possibly Britain. Germany had made plans for war against France and Russia and felt that the longer it waited, the more powerful Russia would become and the greater the risk of defeat. Germany and Austria both decided to risk a European war against France and Russia to resolve the Serbian issue in Austria's favor.
Yes, but think what was just said. This is more Germany, right? Because the Austro-Hungarians, maybe they don't know this at the time, but they are a hollowed shell of what they once were, and they are not going to play some massive role in this upcoming conflict. They are much more of a hindrance to Germany than anything else. But Germany is willing for a continental war against France and Russia. What they're pinning their hopes on, what their big, overall overarching plan is that they can keep Britain out of this conflict. Britain is the linchpin for Germany. If Britain will stay out, they are willing to have this blow up with Russia and France.
If a general war came, victory would allow Germany to dominate the continent. The wild card, of course, was Britain. If the UK fought against them, an Austro-German victory was much less likely and would amount to a worst-case scenario. So in the face of rival alliances and conflicting goals and expectations, the great powers of Europe faced the July crisis of 1914. After Germany's blank check to Austria on July 6th, Austria-Hungary planned to move quickly against Serbia, but that was easier said than done. On July 7th, the Austro-Hungarians planned their next step. Although many were eager for war, the government was not quite united. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza was at first hesitant. The Kingdom of Hungary already included many Serbs, and war with Serbia would only increase those tensions. Tisza insisted that Austria-Hungary deliver an ultimatum to Serbia to give one last opportunity for peace, or to justify eventual military action. Crafting the ultimatum took time, and Tisza only approved the final text on July 19th. The ultimatum text was not the only delay. Many Austro-Hungarian troops were on leave for the harvest, and mobilization would take 2 weeks. Internationally, the French president and prime minister arrived in St. Petersburg on July 20th for a scheduled meeting with the Russians. So if the Austrians gave the ultimatum to Serbia before the French went home, Moscow and Paris might quickly develop a joint response.
Yeah, this is kind of a big deal here, right? The coordination between France and Russia can be done much more quickly if their two leaders are right next to each other whenever the ultimatum's given, right? So they hold off, they wait. I can't remember the exact distance, but they wait until the French prime minister is a certain amount of distance out to sea, and then they send the ultimatum. But you can see here, again, the whole thing is localized and quick, right? And we're seeing here, this is threatening to not be localized because you're worried about France and Russia, and they keep having to push back and push back and push back the ultimatum, and eventually, if there's going to be a conflict, the conflict for this.
It's debated how much the French and Russians may have already known about the coming Austrian ultimatum, but they did use the meeting to portray an image of ironclad unity. As President Raymond Poincaré told the Russians, his primary concern was Britain. "We shall have weighty matters to discuss. I am sure we shall agree on all points, but there is one question which is very much on my mind: our understanding with England. We must get her to come into our alliance."
Okay, so what I'm wondering is, what does everybody think? Do France and Russia go to war if it looks like there's no way that Britain is getting involved? If it looks like literally nothing can be done to pull Britain into this conflict, do Russia and France jump in? Or do they stay on the sidelines and just say like, no, we're not doing it without Britain? That's a harder decision for Russia to make because they have so much kind of riding on this as far as their reputation is concerned. But is Russia willing to jump into a war by themselves? If France holds off because Britain absolutely is not getting involved, is Russia willing to mobilize against the Austro-Hungarian Empire knowing that Germany is going to come in? And so I'm curious what everybody's thoughts are here. If Britain doesn't come in and there's no way they're going to get involved, how does this kind of unfold? How does it play out?
The Austro-Hungarians waited until the French leaders were at sea on July 23rd to send the ultimatum to the Serbs. Of the 10 demands, most concerned the arrest of Serbian officials and the suppression of anti-Habsburg propaganda. To carry this out, the ultimatum demanded that Serbia, quote, accept the collaboration in Serbia of organs of the imperial and royal government of Austria-Hungary. This was tantamount to surrendering Serbian sovereignty, and the Austrians had deliberately drafted the ultimatum so the Serbs would have no choice but to reject it, and war could then be declared. Belgrade replied within the 48-hour deadline and accepted all the points except for those contrary to the Serbian constitution, like allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to prosecute Serbian citizens. The ultimatum triggered a wave of feverish diplomatic activity. The Entente powers now fully realized the seriousness of the crisis, which had mostly been driven behind closed doors in Vienna and Berlin until now. London, Paris, and St. Petersburg condemned the ultimatum, although Britain suggested mediation talks including Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. But Berlin refused. Russo-Austrian relations were by now red hot. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov actually shouted at the Austro-Hungarian ambassador in a meeting. I know what it is. You want to make war on Serbia. The German newspapers have been egging you on. You are setting fire to Europe. It's a great responsibility you are taking on. You will see what effect this has in London and Paris, and maybe elsewhere too. The Tsar ordered partial mobilization of 4 military districts on July 24th, followed by the period preparatory to war on the 26th. The Russian army began to call up reservists, gather supplies, and promote officers. At the same time, the Tsar wanted to make sure that these measures did not appear to be directed at Germany. So Austria-Hungary had a blank check from Germany and had made sure that its ultimatum to Serbia was unacceptable. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The war was still a regional one, but that would all change in the cascade of events in the coming days.
And they declare war without actually being ready for war. Like I said, the whole build-up to this is so bizarre. You have the Russians who are sort of mobilizing, right? You have the Austro-Hungarians who are sort of mobilizing. You have Germany, who the Kaiser is gone on a vacation, comes back and realizes that basically nothing has happened on the Austro-Hungarian Serbian front, when his whole thing was quick, be quick. You know, you have the sympathies of Europe and the rest of the world because Franz Ferdinand has just been assassinated. Use it to your benefit and be quick. Well, he comes back from vacation and basically nothing has happened. You have really tough arguments and conversations going on in Britain about what their role is going to be in this. Are they really going to jump into a general European conflict if it breaks out? Why? What do they have to gain if they do? What do they have to lose if they don't? It's a very kind of tricky situation for a lot of the countries involved.
In reality, partial Russian mobilization was an illusion. The General Staff had no plans to partially mobilize, and Tsar Nicholas's generals told him that partial mobilization would disrupt a potential full mobilization and still likely alarm the Germans. Military and political leaders of all powers were confronted with the same problem. If one army mobilized, its neighbor would feel pressure to do the same or run the risk of an early defeat thanks to modern railways bringing enemy troops to the border within days. This dilemma gave the generals increased influence over the crisis. On July 30th, after overcoming the last-minute nerves, the Tsar announced full mobilization. All eyes now turned to Germany. From July 29th to August 1st, Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm exchanged a series of urgent telegrams.
Yeah, Willie and Nicky.
Affectionately signing Nicky or Willie, the two cousins spoke of their affection for each other, but also issued demands. On July 30th, Willie wrote to Nicky, "I now receive authentic news of serious preparations for war on my eastern frontier. Responsibility for the safety of my empire forces preventive measures of defense upon me. My friendship for you and your empire, transmitted to me by my grandfather on his deathbed, has always been sacred to me, and I have honestly often backed up Russia. The peace of Europe may still be maintained by you if Russia will agree to stop the military measures which must threaten Germany and Austria-Hungary." London now tried to mediate again, including a proposal for Austro-Hungarian forces to stop at Belgrade. On the 29th, German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg asked Britain to stay neutral if Germany promised not to touch French possessions. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey now desperately sought clarification from his own cabinet, 2/3 of which had previously opposed the war. Cabinet member John Burns summed up the decision. "Situation seriously reviewed from all points of view. It was decided not to decide."
Yeah, and that's the... So it said earlier that really this kind of sneaks up on everybody because it's thought for a while that it is going to be kind of this localized thing. It probably won't break out into an actual war. If it is, it'll be localized. Once things start to progress between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, everybody kind of wakes up to the realization that if the Austro-Hungarian army goes to war with Serbia, Russia is going to mobilize. And that opens up so many, boxes, Pandora's boxes, because if Russian mobilization happens, then German mobilization has to happen. If German mobilization happens, then French mobilization has to happen. And so you can see everybody kind of starts waking up, slowly to the idea that this could turn into a massive explosion very quickly. And so again, everybody's kind of trying to feel their way through the dark and see if there's any way to skirt this, if there's any last, ditch efforts they could make to kind of pull everybody back from the ledge. You have arguments in the countries about what their best move is about mobilizing or getting involved or not getting involved. So everybody's kind of between a rock and a hard place. So you can understand why it was decided not to decide. Because how do you decide on whether or not jumping into what looks to be a general European war, that could just destroy everything that you know?
Britain still would not say if it would join the Entente in case of a general war. Hollweg was now unsure of British intentions and tried to rein in the Austro-Hungarians, including suggesting the halt in Belgrade plan. Meanwhile, the German Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke was encouraging Conrad to attack. This led to Conrad explaining, "Who actually rules in Berlin, Bethmann or Moltke?" But the Austro-Hungarians claimed it was now too late to change course, and a temporary occupation of Belgrade would not achieve their aims. Moltke also began to push for Germany to mobilize, since the German war plan depended on speed to avoid a two-front war. The Schlieffen Plan called for German armies to first defeat France while Russia was still mobilizing, then shift the German troops to the east. If Russia was allowed to mobilize first, Germany would be at a disadvantage. The Germans had started preparing on July 28th, but on the 31st, Kaiser Wilhelm announced pre-mobilization, the Kriegsgefahrzustand, or state of threatening danger of war. The decision led to another flurry of telegrams. Germany demanded that Russia cease mobilization, while simultaneously asking Austria-Hungary to prepare for operations against Russia. The Germans also asked for French and British neutrality in a seemingly imminent Russo-German war. In Britain, a third royal cousin, King George, now called on the Tsar to end mobilization. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith recalled the moment he presented a draft telegram to the king. The poor king was hauled from his bed, and one of my strangest experiences was sitting with him. I read the message and the proposed answer. All he did was suggest that it should be made more personal and direct, by the insertion of the words, "My dear Nicky," and the addition at the end of the signature, "Georgie." And so, as July 1914 came to an end, there was a frenzy of diplomatic messages between European capitals. For many military leaders, though, it was too late for any more talk, and they began to pressure the politicians to act. On July 31st, French General Joseph Joffre asked his government to reverse its more passive policy and mobilize.
I bet you that Joseph Joffre regretted that decision. Man, he has a rough job in the war.
President Poincaré described the meeting, which lasted into the wee hours of August 1st. Joffre appeared with the placid face of a calm, resolute man whose only fear is lest France, outstripped by German mobilization, the most rapid of them all, might speedily find herself in an irreparable state of inferiority. France finally mobilized at 4 p.m. on August 1st. In Berlin, Moltke was having this.
Do you guys think if France does not mobilize? Because, see, the thought process here is everybody has to mobilize for fear that if you're attacked by a neighbor that is already mobilized, if you haven't done it yet, if you're behind the 8 ball on the mobilization efforts, then you'll lose the war really before it's even started. But if France doesn't mobilize here, do you guys think that Germany invades France? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if Germany mobilizes and Russia mobilizes, obviously, and then you have the Austro-Hungarians who are going to march on Serbia. If France and the UK declared neutrality on the war, does Germany declare war on them anyway and start invading France? Because I don't think that that's the case. I think the whole thing here is everybody is acting out of fear. Out of fear and kind of like self-preservation of what could potentially happen if they were to get behind. I think this could have been a Russo-German war, more or less. And you know, areas of the Balkans too, obviously. But with the French mobilization, then, you know, Germany already, the reason I think this is because the Germans' whole fear is a war against France and Russia. That's why they have the Schlieffen Plan, right? But if France isn't a fear of jumping in, if they say that they're staying on the sideline, I don't think Germany goes out of its way to pull France into the conflict. I think they go smash Russia. And I think they absolutely would smash Russia in this war if the UK and France were on the sidelines.
Same conversation with Chancellor Hollweg, and 30 minutes later, Germany announced their mobilization. By 7 p.m., Moscow told Berlin that Russia would not stop its mobilization, and so Germany declared war on Russia. On August 2nd, German troops were on the move, not east, but west into neutral Luxembourg. This was in accordance with the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans said was a strategic necessity. The British position was still not clear. London sent ambiguous messages to Berlin suggesting that Britain might remain neutral if Germany did not attack France. Kaiser Wilhelm now asked Moltke to abandon the Schlieffen Plan and stop his armies from marching across the French border. Von Moltke replied that stopping the massive and complex mobilization was impossible and suicidal. The Kaiser was angry, and his answer showed that he did not fully understand his own military machine.
Yep.
Your illustrious uncle von Moltke the Elder would not have given me such an answer. If I order it, it must be possible.
There is nothing that shows the lack of knowledge that Kaiser Wilhelm has for military affairs than the way that he is kind of treated and the way that he handles this war. It's brutal. And later in the war, they'll basically totally push him to the side.
Soon after, the Kaiser learned that there was no formal British offer to stay neutral and gave his armies the green light to follow the plan and invade Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. By August 2nd, the mood in Britain had shifted towards intervention. The British informed the French that they would block any German naval movements in the Channel and would uphold Belgian neutrality. Belgian neutrality was Britain's final red line, but it was a line that Germany had already begun to cross. The same day, Germany delivered an ultimatum to Belgium that it had prepared back on July 26th. The Germans claimed the French planned to enter Belgium, so Germany had no choice but to move in preemptively. If Belgium resisted, the Germans would consider it an enemy. Brussels replied to Berlin on August 3rd. The intentions Germany ascribes to France are in contradiction with the formal declarations made to us. The infringement of Belgium's independence, with which the German governments threaten her, would constitute a flagrant violation of international law. No strategic interest justifies such a breach of law. The Belgian government is firmly resolved to repel every infringement of its rights by all means in its power.
That is ballsy, but awesome. I mean, think about what that means. The response that Belgium just gave Germany, who without a doubt is going to steamroll Belgium. Basically, they say, hey, you can either let us march through to France, and if you do let us march through, we'll keep our hands to ourselves, we won't mess anything up, we'll be completely good. But if you don't let us march through, and you do anything at all to hinder us getting through, because we're coming through. We're not asking to come through. We're coming through. If you try to stop us, then we are going to treat you like a belligerent in this war. And Belgium's response is basically like, yeah, that doesn't work for us. Like, so I guess march through, but you're going to be met with resistance. It's just, like I said, I've said this 100 times on this channel, but those types of really smaller, less strong countries, like standing up and fighting really well against basically insurmountable odds, those are just awesome stories to me.
That same day, the final dominoes began to fall. Italy declared that it would stay neutral and would not join its Triple Alliance partners in war. Germany claimed France was about to attack it, which wasn't true, and declared war on France. On August 4th, German troops marched into Belgium. Belgium appealed to Britain, France, and Russia to guarantee her independence, and Britain declared war on Germany. By August 4th, the great powers of Europe were at war, and the First World War had begun. In the next 4 years, roughly 20 million people would be killed or die of disease and hunger. But even before the killing stopped, debates were raging about the war's origins and who was to blame, and they haven't stopped since. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, each of the powers published a so-called color book, making its case as to how to understand the July crisis and basically blaming the other side. After the war, each side still blamed the other, and the Allies put the responsibility squarely on the Central Powers in the post-war peace treaties. Since then, the evidence of 1914 has been interpreted in many different ways as historians have tried to answer who was at fault for starting the war. For years, many historians concluded that all the powers shared some of the blame for the war beginning. Then, in the 1960s, German historian Fritz Fischer made one of the most influential arguments. He claimed that the German government and military elites had grandiose plans and wanted to achieve them through war. The Fischer School claims Germany had long planned a war aimed against Russia and France and directly led Austro-Hungarian actions in order to escalate events. More recently, other single powers have been fingered for their role in the crisis. Sean McMeekin emphasized that Russia's actions turned a Balkan war into a continental one, and Niall Ferguson blamed Britain for its mistakes and naivete.
Yeah, so we've talked about all of these different arguments before. Everybody obviously has a hand in this. It's not one group's or one country's, fault alone. I would say, well, it's hard to decipher because everybody is reacting solely on fear. I mean, seriously, fear drives so much of what people are doing in regards to this conflict that it's really hard to kind of grade that on a scale. And you can understand why they're fearful. With Germany attacking France, that's why I said the thing about if France totally stays out and declares neutrality, does Germany still attack them? Because once France mobilizes, Germany has to attack them. Because the only way that they could see themselves winning a two-front war is if they don't fight it as a two-front war. If they knock France out and then go fight Russia and fight two one-front wars. With everybody, it's just all of the arguments for why each individual power is to blame, I actually think hold some merit, right? For France, for Britain, for Germany, for the Austro-Hungarians, for Russia, even for Serbia. I think they all hold some merit, but I think the reason for that is because there isn't just one country that is solely to blame here, even if it may come off later as if, as if the side that lost is to blame for the whole thing.
Some other recent interpretations, like Christopher Clark's sleepwalker theory, suggest the war was largely unintended and resulted from miscalculations, misunderstandings, and perceived insecurities. He argues that Germany felt Russia and Britain were unlikely to become involved and tried its best to localize the conflict in the Balkans. Another debate centers around whether the war was inevitable. Here, the recent consensus is that the alliance system did not force any state to fight, as Italy proved by staying neutral in 1914. This line of thinking stresses that there were many times when things might have taken a different turn, like if Austria had acted more quickly against Serbia, or if Britain had taken a clear position right from the start of the crisis. There's also discussion.
I think that's a big one. If Britain is open about their position, which you can't really blame them because they don't have a position when things are first starting to unfold. But I think had they declared early, everybody's thought process changes because Britain is the huge wild card in this equation.
About culture and mentality in 1914. Historian James Joel, for example, suggests that the cultural, military, and strategic zeitgeist saw war as a practical and indeed desirable tool for social change and defense of national interests. Since modern war also involved the need for a quick mobilization via rail timetables, military commanders became as or even more important than politicians in the crisis. But their inflexible strategies could not respond to the political needs, so perceived military necessity dictated political action. Russian politicians wanted partial mobilization not to scare Germany, but did just that. And German politicians did not want to bring Britain into the war, but their armies marched into Belgium and did just that. This was the exact opposite of Clausewitz's concept that war is politics by other means. And it's an important aspect of understanding how the crisis ended in a world war. The war that started with the July crisis in 1914 lasted more than 4 years. But the war amongst historians to make sense of it all still rages more than a century later. The dramatic events that led to the First World War changed the world forever. 31 years after the July crisis, Europe saw the end of the Second World War, which was partially born from unsettled scores and further radicalization after 1918. In 1945, there would be no peace until total surrender, and in April that year, the Soviet army launched their final offensive on the German capital of Berlin. In our 4.5-hour, 18-part documentary series, 16 Days in Berlin, we chronicle this final battle. It features original film footage from Soviet cameramen, never-before-seen photos of the battle, detailed maps and animations, and expert interviews with David Willey from the Tank Museum, Ian from Forgotten Weapons, and more. Unfortunately, we can't upload this series to YouTube because it shows the grim reality of the Second World War, and that would get us demonetized or worse. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin in 4K resolution? On Nebula, a streaming service we built together with other creators and where we can upload documentaries without fear of demonetization. If you want to get Nebula, Curiosity Stream, this video's sponsor, has a pretty sweet bundle deal for you.
Okay, so this was a good video. Why did the First World War break out? Yeah, there are a lot of things that went into it. Obviously, it's one of the more bizarre, unfolding of circumstances maybe ever. Certainly that led to the amount of destruction and chaos as World War One did. I'm wondering what everybody thinks about. There's an argument from historians, and a decent amount of historians too, that things would have been better. The world, Europe, things would have been generally better had Germany won World War One. That then the layout of the rest of the century doesn't unfold in the way that it does if Germany, this young new power, wins the war and then ends up kind of taking its place on the world stage. I'm curious what everybody thinks about that and everything else in this video. It was a really good one. I'll have another one out tomorrow. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the Discord link in the description box down below. You can always go down there to find it. We have good conversations over there about all sorts of stuff, history related and all across the board. There's a bunch of different history stuff on there. So if you want to talk to other people that are interested in the same sort of history stuff as you, jump on there, and I will see you all next time.